5 padlocks snapped shut, sealing cold iron around his wrists, waist, and ankles. 50 pounds of industrial logging chain bit brutally into his flesh. "Bust one," Parker mocked, flicking a half-smoked cigarette right at Bruce's feet. "And you walk." It was the stupidest bet a dead man ever made. Sweat cooled on Bruce's neck, forming a sticky, uncomfortable film against the damp November air. He'd been in the studio for 9 hours straight. His joints carried that familiar deep bone ache that came from pushing the human frame past its intended mechanical limits. He rubbed his knuckles together, feeling the raw, weeping skin over his index and middle fingers where the heavy canvas bag had finally won a small victory. He didn't feel like a legend tonight. He felt like a tired 30-something man who desperately wanted a hot shower, a bowl of rice, and absolute silence. Footsteps broke the quiet, not the rhythmic, purposeful tap of a late-night pedestrian. This was the erratic, heavy scuffing of cheap rubber soles, trying and failing to walk softly on loose gravel. 5 distinct rhythms. 5 men. Bruce didn't turn around. He stopped beneath the sickly amber glow of a busted street lamp on the edge of the Oakland shipping yards. The air here tasted of salt, old motor oil, and decaying wood. He let his shoulders drop, exhaling slowly to bleed the latent tension from his muscles. Parker stepped out of the alleyway first. He smelled sharply of stale gin and old copper pennies, a scent Bruce instantly associated with nervous aggression. Parker held a sawn-off shotgun. The abbreviated barrel trembled just a fraction in his grip. Behind him filed Miller, a heavy breather whose nose whistled with every intake of air. Cobb, a massive wall of cheap denim and unwashed hair. Decker, twitchy, rhythmically slapping a rusted crowbar against his own thigh. And Wyatt, who carried a canvas duffel bag that clinked with a dense metallic dread. "Easy now, Hollywood!" Parker sneered, his voice overcompensating for the shake in his hands. "Keep your hands where I can see the knuckles." Bruce assessed the geometry of the alley. It was too narrow. Miller and Cobb were flanking him, effectively cutting off the street exit. Decker was hovering near a rusted dumpster, blocking the rear. And Parker stood 10 feet away, perfect spread pattern distance for a sawn-off. If Bruce moved, he could close the gap in under a second, shattering Parker's trachea before the man's brain registered the shift in reality. But shotguns had hair triggers, and dead men's fingers tended to spasm. A blast here would tear him in half. He felt a flicker of genuine annoyance, not fear, but a deep, heavy exhaustion. He hated cheap traps. "Drop to your knees," Parker ordered, racking the shotgun with a harsh metallic clack that echoed off the brick walls. Bruce looked at the gun, then up at Parker's dilated pupils. There was no reasoning with men flying on cheap liquor and adrenaline. Bruce slowly lowered himself, feeling the wet grit of the asphalt bite sharply through his slacks and into his kneecaps. The dampness immediately seeped into the fabric, chilling his skin. "Get the iron on him, fast," Parker snapped. Wyatt stepped forward, unzipping the duffel. The smell of machine grease and oxidized metal hit the air. He pulled out lengths of thick industrial logging chain and a cluster of heavy brass padlocks. They didn't just tie him up, they anchored him to his own anatomy. Cobb grabbed Bruce's arms, wrenching them behind his back with a grunt. Bruce felt a sharp twinge in his left rotator cuff, an old, lingering injury that flared up in the cold. He grimaced, suppressing the instinct to twist his hips and throw the giant man over his shoulder. Wyatt began wrapping the iron. The metal was ice cold. It shocked Bruce's overheated skin, raising goosebumps along his forearms. Wyatt looped the chain around Bruce's wrists, pulling the links brutally tight before snapping a heavy padlock through the iron. Then came the torso. They wrapped a second chain around his chest, pinning his biceps to his ribs. The links dug into his pectoral muscles, restricting the expansion of his rib cage. Every time he tried to draw a full breath, the iron bit deeper, bruising the intercostal muscles between his ribs. "Tighter," Decker hissed from the shadows, stepping closer with the crowbar. "This is the guy from the television. I heard he punched a guy through a wooden door." "He's just a guy in a fancy suit, Decker," Parker shot back, though he kept the shotgun leveled exactly at Bruce's chest. "Shut up and lock his ankles." Miller knelt in the puddles, fumbling with the chains around Bruce's boots. His hands were shaking so badly that the brass padlock repeatedly slipped from his grasp, clattering against the asphalt. Bruce could hear the wet, panicked whistling of Miller's breath. It was pathetic, yet infinitely dangerous. Panicked men made fatal mistakes. "Done," Miller gasped, scrambling backward as if Bruce were a coiled rattlesnake. Bruce tested the bindings with a micro-movement. His wrists were immobilized. His chest was bound so tightly, his heart felt like it was beating against a brick wall. His ankles were hobbled, leaving exactly 3 inches of slack between his feet. He was locked in a cocoon of 50 pounds of dead steel. "Drag him inside," Parker ordered, nodding toward an abandoned meatpacking shed that sat rotting on the edge of the lot. Cobb and Wyatt grabbed Bruce by the armpits. They hauled him up, hauling him over the uneven ground. Bruce's boots dragged through the mud and broken glass. He didn't fight them. He let his body go entirely limp, turning himself into dead weight. It exhausted Cobb and Wyatt faster, their breath coming in ragged, angry huffs by the time they threw him into the shed. Bruce hit the concrete floor hard, his chained shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Pain flared, sharp and electric, shooting up his neck. He bit the inside of his cheek, tasting the sudden warmth of his own blood, and forced his face into a mask of total, terrifying neutrality. The inside of the meatpacking shed smelled of ancient ammonia, dried blood, and rotting timber. A single, naked bulb hummed violently from the ceiling, casting long, bruised shadows across the grease-stained walls. They hauled Bruce up and shoved him against a thick concrete load-bearing pillar. He slumped against it, his breathing artificially shallow to accommodate the brutal constriction of the chest chain. Miller paced frantically in a tight circle, pulling a crushed cigarette from his pocket and lighting it with trembling hands. The sharp sulfur of the match cut through the ammonia. The cherry of the cigarette flared bright orange, illuminating Miller's yellowed teeth and wide, bloodshot eyes. "We got him!" Decker muttered, tapping the crowbar against his palm. "We actually got him." "Told you," Parker said, lowering the shotgun finally, resting the barrel over his shoulder. He walked up to Bruce, closing the distance to less than 2 feet. Parker's face was shiny with sweat, his eyes alight with the intoxicating arrogance of a man who believed he had just conquered a god. "You're smaller in person," Parker noted, looking Bruce up and down. He leaned in close. The gin on his breath was nauseating. 50 grand. That's what your studio's going to pay to get you back in one piece. If they don't, well, Decker wants to see if your knees bend backward." Bruce didn't look at Parker's face. He wasn't paying attention to the threats. He was entirely focused on his own physical reality. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, mapping the iron on his body. The human brain naturally perceives chains as a solid, inescapable mass. Bruce trained himself decades ago to ignore the mass and focus entirely on the mechanics. A chain is not a singular object. It is a series of independent loops. It is only as strong as its weakest weld, its slackest angle, or the locking mechanism binding it together. He felt the cold bite of the steel against his spine. He subtly shifted his weight to his right heel, feeling the uneven topography of the concrete floor beneath his thin-soled shoe. He found a slight depression in the stone, a tiny groove. He anchored the edge of his heel into it. It wasn't much, but it was a fulcrum. You could move the earth if you had a fulcrum. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Chinaman," Parker barked, backhanding Bruce across the jaw. The slap was sloppy. It lacked kinetic transfer. Bruce's head barely moved, but the sting bloomed hot on his cheek. He opened his eyes. The dark, bottomless intensity in Bruce's stare caused Parker to take a subconscious half-step backward. Parker immediately hated himself for retreating. To overcompensate, he puffed out his chest, stepping back into Bruce's space. I heard you're some kind of magician," Parker spat, spit flying from his lips and hitting Bruce's collar. "I heard you break concrete blocks without pulling your fist back. I heard you're untouchable." Parker reached down and grabbed the heavy brass padlock securing the chest chain, violently rattling it against Bruce's sternum. Bruce let out a short, forced breath as the metal bruised his chest bone. "Look at you now," Parker laughed, turning to his crew. Cobb chuckled, a low, wet sound. "You're just a little guy wrapped in half-inch steel." Where's the magic, huh? Bruce continued his internal audit. He noticed something about the way Wyatt had fastened the waist chain. Wyatt had been rushing, panicked by the dark alley and the myth of the man he was binding. In his haste, Wyatt had twisted the chain over itself near Bruce's left hip, creating a figure-8 bind before snapping the padlock through the overlapping links. It was a fatal structural error. By twisting the chain, Wyatt had created a localized torque point. The links weren't laying flat against each other. They were binding at a sharp, unnatural angle. More importantly, the shackle of the padlock, the hardened steel U-bar, was wedged directly against the cheap brass body of the lock itself at an awkward angle. Brass is dense, but it is a relatively soft alloy compared to hardened carbon steel. It is designed to withstand downward pulling force, not lateral, twisting pressure. Bruce inhaled, forcing his diaphragm to push outward against the chain, measuring the exact millimeter of slack he possessed. He felt his ribcage scream in protest. He ignored it. He needed a half-inch of play. He had perhaps 3/8 of an inch. It would have to be enough. Parker flicked his cigarette. It bounced off Bruce's leather shoe, scattering orange sparks across the damp floor. "Tell you what, Magic Man," Parker said, leaning in so close their noses almost touched. "I'll make you a wager." Parker gestured expansively with his free hand. "Bust one chain, just one. You do that and you walk. I'll even hold the damn door open for you." Miller stopped pacing. Decker stopped tapping the crowbar. The room went dead silent, save for the violent humming of the light bulb. Parker was grinning, showing a chipped front tooth. It was the ultimate display of dominance, offering a prisoner a completely impossible avenue of escape just to watch them drown in despair. Parker wanted Bruce to struggle. He wanted to see the veins pop in the martial artist's neck. He wanted to watch Bruce thrash against the iron like an animal in a snare, only to slump back in absolute, humiliating defeat. Bruce looked down at the twisted bind near his hip. Then he looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Parker. The exhaustion was gone. The annoyance had evaporated. What replaced it was a cold, absolute apex predator focus. His pupils dilated slightly, taking in the ambient light. Bruce finally spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy from the cold air, but carried a terrible, vibrating calm. "Are you a gambling man, Parker?" Parker's grin faltered for a microsecond. He didn't like the tone. There was no fear in it. There was no desperation. It was the tone of a surgeon asking for a scalpel. "I bet on sure things," Parker countered, puffing out his chest. "Go ahead, bust it. Show us the magic." Bruce didn't thrash. He didn't scream or flex like a weightlifter. Instead, he closed his eyes again. He allowed his heart rate to drop. He visualized the kinetic chain of his own body. He needed to generate maximum rotational force in a space no larger than a shoebox. The power wouldn't come from his chest or his arms. They were immobilized. It had to come from the ground, from the earth. Up through the anchor of his heel, through the heavy musculature of his calves, twisting into his glutes, and finally snapping through the torque of his hips. He had to turn his own body into a hydraulic press. He took one final shallow breath. The air tasted of rust and impending violence. Bruce anchored his right heel into the concrete groove. He felt the cold iron biting into his flesh, promising pain. He welcomed it. Pain was just data. He locked his knees, dropping his center of gravity by a fraction of an inch, and prepared to cash in Parker's bet. Muscle memory eclipsed rational thought. Bruce didn't just push against the iron. He twisted his entire skeletal structure into a violent, localized coil. Force requires a foundation. Bruce's right heel ground into the shallow depression of the concrete, locking his leg into a rigid pillar. He drove the kinetic energy upward, through his calf, snapping his hip laterally with a sudden vicious jerk. It wasn't a smooth, cinematic motion. It was an ugly, desperate spasm of absolute biomechanical efficiency. The heavy logging chain immediately tightened, biting through his slacks and shredding the skin over his hip bone. A hot flare of agony shot up his spine, sharp enough to make his vision blur at the edges, but he ignored the flesh. Flesh was yielding. Iron was stubborn. He focused on the brass padlock resting against his left side. Because of Wyatt's rushed, panicked binding, the chain had crossed over itself, creating a thick steel wedge underneath the U-bar of the brass lock. As Bruce rotated his hips with everything he had, that steel wedge functioned exactly like a crowbar. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. The universe shrank to the pressure in Bruce's rib cage and the smell of his own sweat mingling with the ammonia of the shed. His breath hitched. His muscles screamed under the isometric load, vibrating so violently that the chain links began to chatter against one another, a low, terrifying metallic hum. Then, the brass groaned. It was a high-pitched metallic squeal, like nails dragging across a chalkboard, amplified. The hardened steel of the chain links dug relentlessly into the softer brass body of the padlock. The lock's internal pins warped, the housing stretched. Parker's smug grin vanished, replaced by a sudden slack-jawed incomprehension. He took a half-step back, the shotgun dipping slightly. Bruce pushed harder, throwing the last reserve of his core strength into the rotation, tearing the bruised muscles in his own oblique. Crack! The sound was sharp and deafening, like a small-caliber gunshot echoing in the damp shed. The brass padlock didn't just open, it structurally failed. The side of the lock blew outward, sending a jagged piece of brass shrapnel pinging violently off the concrete pillar. The U-bar warped and slipped free. Gravity took over instantly. 50 pounds of heavy logging chains sloughed off Bruce's chest and waist, crashing to the floor in a dead, heavy metallic heap. Bruce gasped, a harsh, ragged intake of air as his rib cage finally expanded to its full capacity. The sudden rush of oxygen made him dizzy. He leaned against the concrete pillar, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. His left hip was bleeding freely. The torn fabric of his trousers soaked with dark, warm wetness. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash, haggard, battered, but undeniably alive. His arms were still locked behind his back, and his ankles were still hobbled by the short chain. But the chest bind was gone. He could breathe. He could twist. Nobody moved. The 5 men stared at the pile of iron on the floor, their brains struggling to process the physics of what they had just witnessed. They had wrapped this man in industrial steel, and he had shattered it with a twitch of his hips. Miller dropped his cigarette. It hissed quietly in a puddle of dirty water. "You," Parker stammered, the gin courage evaporating entirely from his system. His hands began to shake again, worse than before in the alleyway. "What the hell are you?" Bruce spat a mouthful of metallic-tasting saliva onto the concrete. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Parker. He was exhausted. He was bleeding. But the annoyance from the alleyway had coalesced into a cold, terrifying anger. "I'm a man who just won a bet," Bruce said, his voice a low, raspy whisper that carried over the hum of the overhead bulb. "Hold the door." Parker's face contorted, panic giving way to the vicious cruelty of a cornered animal. The bet was a joke, a psychological torture device. He never intended to let the man walk. "Screw the bet," Parker shrieked, his voice cracking as he jerked the sawn-off shotgun back up to his shoulder. "Break his legs, hit him, Cobb." Before Parker's finger could even tighten on the trigger, Bruce moved. He didn't have the use of his hands, and his stride was restricted to 3 inches, but he had his core, and he had his knees. Bruce lunged forward, not stepping, but executing a brutal 2-footed hop that closed the distance to Cobb in a fraction of a second. Cobb was massive, a hulking wall of muscle and cheap denim, but he was slow. He was still reaching for Bruce's collar when Bruce launched his entire body weight upward. Bruce's right knee connected squarely with the underside of Cobb's jaw. The impact sounded like a baseball bat striking a wet, heavy bag. Cobb's teeth clicked together with bone-shattering force. His eyes rolled back into his head instantly, and the giant man crumpled backward, hitting the concrete floor with a heavy, sickening thud. He didn't twitch. Decker screamed, swinging the rusted crowbar in a wild, horizontal arc aimed at Bruce's skull. Bruce ducked. His footing slipped on the slick, greasy floor, and he went down hard on his right knee, the sharp pain shooting up his thigh. It wasn't a clean dodge. The heavy iron end of the crowbar clipped Bruce's shoulder, tearing the fabric of his jacket and sending a hot flare of agony through his collarbone. He gritted his teeth, riding the momentum of his slip. As Decker overextended from the missed swing, Bruce swept his hobbled legs in a tight, violent arc. The heavy logging chain binding his ankles became a flail. The steel links caught Decker squarely behind the knees. Decker's legs folded backward. He went airborne for a split second before slamming face first into the concrete. His nose shattered with a wet crunch, blood instantly pooling beneath his face as he groaned in agony. 2 down in under 3 seconds. Miller didn't even try. The heavy breather took one look at Cobb unconscious on the floor, and Decker writhing in his own blood, and his nervous system chose flight. Miller turned and sprinted for the rotting wooden door of the shed, his boots slipping frantically on the damp floor. "Shoot him, Wyatt! Shoot him!" Parker screamed, backpedaling away from Bruce, trying to track the martial artist with the wide spread of the shotgun barrel. Wyatt lunged from the shadows, grabbing Bruce from behind. He locked his thick forearms around Bruce's throat, applying a crude, desperate chokehold, dragging Bruce backward off his feet. Bruce couldn't use his hands to break the grip. His lungs burned as Wyatt clamped down, cutting off the carotid arteries. Black spots began to dance in Bruce's peripheral vision. He felt the cold panic of asphyxiation creeping in. He didn't fight the pull. Instead, Bruce drove his weight backward, aggressively slamming his own skull backward into Wyatt's face. He felt the crunch of cartilage against the back of his head. Wyatt yelped, his grip loosening just a fraction of an inch. It was all the leverage Bruce needed. Bruce planted his chained feet and violently thrust his hips forward, bending at the waist. He threw Wyatt completely over his shoulder in a messy, chaotic judo throw. Wyatt slammed back first onto the pile of discarded chest chains. The air exploded from Wyatt's lungs in a violent wheeze, and he lay there, clutching his bruised spine, completely incapacitated. Parker finally found his nerve. He leveled the shotgun at Bruce's chest. "Freeze!" Parker roared, spittle flying from his lips. Bruce was on his knees, gasping for breath, his shoulder throbbing where the crowbar had hit him, his hip bleeding steadily. He was in the kill zone. At 5 feet, the buckshot would spread just enough to tear his chest cavity apart. But Parker was shaking. The barrel of the shotgun trembled violently. He was looking at a man whose hands were still tied behind his back, whose ankles were bound, who was bleeding and bruised. And yet, Parker was the one who was terrified. "Shoot me!" Bruce wheezed, tilting his head slightly, his eyes burning with a dark, unyielding intensity. "Pull it, because if you miss my heart, I'm going to take that gun and beat you to death with it." Parker's breath hitched. He looked at Cobb's motionless body. He looked at Decker crying on the floor. He looked at Wyatt gasping for air. The shed was silent save for the violent hum of the single light bulb and the ragged breathing of broken men. Parker's finger trembled on the trigger. The pressure required was minimal, just a few pounds of force. But the psychological weight of pulling it against a man who looked back with such absolute, predatory calm was too much. The gin had worn off, leaving nothing but stark, hollow cowardice. With a pathetic, choked sob, Parker dropped the shotgun. It clattered loudly against the concrete. He raised his hands, trembling, tears of pure adrenaline and fear cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. "Please," Parker whispered. Bruce stared at him for a long, heavy moment. He didn't feel victorious. He felt cold, tired, and deeply annoyed that his favorite jacket was ruined. Slowly, painfully, Bruce stood up. His hip burned, his shoulder ached. He hopped over to the rusted dumpster, turning his back to Parker, and hooked his chained wrists over a jagged piece of exposed metal near the hinge. He twisted violently, using the leverage to snap the cheap padlock securing his wrists. He rubbed his raw, bleeding wrists, finally bringing his hands to the front of his body. He bent down, picked up a stray piece of steel from the broken lock, and jammed it into the keyhole of his ankle bindings, twisting until the pins popped. He stepped out of the iron. Bruce didn't look at Parker again. He didn't offer a parting quip or a moral lesson. He walked to the wooden door, his shoes crunching on the glass and gravel, and pushed it open. The cold November night air rushed in, smelling of salt and freedom. He stepped out into the dark, leaving the 5 men alone in the shed with their chains and their regret. If you felt the weight of the iron and the grit of the concrete in this story, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support, share this raw look at the legend with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, unfiltered stories of grit and survival. We bring you the sweat, the struggle, and the reality behind the myths every single week. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the bet? See you in the next one.